I was standing in my driveway in Madison, Wisconsin, staring at the most ridiculous violation notice I had ever received, when I realized that my neighbor Patricia Wainwright had officially lost her mind. My name is Yosef Abrams, and I have lived in the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision for 3 years now. It is a decent neighborhood with tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, and unfortunately, an increasingly aggressive home owner association board that seems to have nothing better to do than harass residents over the most trivial matters imaginable. I work as an aerospace engineer for a defense contractor downtown, and I have always prided myself on keeping my property in good condition. My lawn is mowed regularly, my hedges are trimmed. My house is painted a tasteful shade of gray that falls well within the approved color palette, and I have never once violated any legitimate HOA rule. Until today, apparently. The violation notice, printed on official HOA letterhead with Patricia's name emblazoned at the bottom as board president, stated that I was in violation of Section 8.4 of the Community Guidelines for maintaining hazardous exterior conditions that pose a danger to neighboring properties and pedestrians. The specific infraction: the natural icicles hanging from my roof. It was the 3rd week of January, and Wisconsin was experiencing one of the coldest winters in recent memory. Temperatures had been hovering around -5 degrees Fahrenheit for days, with wind chills dropping to -20. Every single house on my street, including Patricia's own McMansion 3 doors down, had icicles hanging from the gutters and eaves. This was not some maintenance issue or sign of neglect. This was physics. This was winter in Wisconsin. I crumpled the notice in my fist and marched directly to Patricia's house. The sidewalks were covered in a fresh layer of snow from last night's storm, and my boots crunched loudly as I walked. I could see Patricia's silver Lexus in her driveway, so I knew she was home. When I reached her front door, I knocked firmly 3 times. She answered after about 30 seconds, wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater and perfectly applied makeup despite it being 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning. Patricia was in her mid-50s, with blonde hair styled in that particular way that screamed, "I would like to speak to the manager." She had moved into the neighborhood about 2 years ago and had immediately inserted herself into every aspect of community governance, eventually getting herself elected as HOA board president last spring. "Yosef," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "what can I do for you?" I held up the crumpled violation notice. "You can explain to me why I am being cited for having icicles on my house during winter in Wisconsin." She pressed her lips together in a thin line. "The HOA guidelines are very clear about maintaining safe conditions on your property. Those icicles are a liability hazard. If one were to fall and injure someone, the entire association could be held responsible. Patricia, every house on this street has icicles. Your house has icicles. This is what happens when snow melts and refreezes. It is called weather." "My icicles are much smaller than yours," she said primly, "and I have already arranged to have mine professionally removed. I suggest you do the same. You have 7 days to remedy the situation, or the association will fine you $500. I could feel my blood pressure rising. This is absolutely insane. I am not paying someone to remove naturally occurring ice formations that will just form again the next time it snows. "Then I suppose you will be paying the fine," Patricia said. "The rules apply to everyone equally, Yosef. I do not make exceptions, even for neighbors I like." Her smile was saccharine and completely insincere. "I want to see the exact bylaw you are citing," I said, "because I have read the community guidelines front to back, and I do not remember anything about icicles." She sighed dramatically, as if I were a difficult child. Section 8.4 covers hazardous exterior conditions. It gives the board broad authority to address any situation that could pose a risk to the community. The interpretation of that section falls under my purview as board president. Your interpretation is ridiculous, I said flatly. I am not removing naturally occurring icicles, and I am not paying your bogus fine. Patricia's expression hardened. Then I will have no choice but to escalate this matter to code enforcement. If you refuse to maintain your property in accordance with community standards, perhaps the city can convince you otherwise. You do that, I said, turning to leave. I would love to hear what code enforcement has to say about this nonsense. I walked back to my house, fuming. This was not the first time Patricia had found some petty reason to harass me. 6 months ago, she had cited me for leaving my garbage cans visible from the street for more than 2 hours after pickup. Before that, she had sent me a warning letter because my holiday lights stayed up until January 6th, which she claimed was 3 days too long. Each time, I had complied with her demands just to keep the peace. But this was too much. The icicles hanging from my roof were completely natural. They were not even particularly large or dangerous. The longest ones were maybe 8 inches, comparable to every other house in the neighborhood. There was no legitimate safety concern here. Patricia was simply on a power trip, and I was her latest target. I went inside and made myself coffee, trying to calm down. My house was a modest 3-bedroom ranch that I had purchased after my divorce 3 years ago. It was nothing fancy, but it was mine, and I had worked hard to make it comfortable. The interior was warm and cozy, a welcome contrast to the bitter cold outside. I sat at my kitchen table and reread the violation notice more carefully. The letter referenced Section 8.4, just as Patricia had said. I pulled up the HOA bylaws on my laptop and found the relevant section. It read, "Homeowners shall maintain their properties in a safe and presentable condition, free from hazardous exterior conditions including but not limited to damaged roofing materials, loose siding, unstable structures, or any other condition that may pose a danger to neighboring properties, pedestrians, or the aesthetic integrity of the community." The language was indeed vague enough that Patricia could theoretically interpret it to include icicles, but it was a massive stretch. The section clearly seemed intended to address actual maintenance issues like damaged roofs or unsafe structures, not natural winter conditions. I took screenshots of the bylaw and saved them to a folder on my desktop. Then, I did something I probably should have done months ago. I started digging into Patricia's history as HOA board president. I pulled up the meeting minutes from the past year, all of which were supposedly available to homeowners through the community website. What I found was troubling. In the past 10 months, Patricia had issued violation notices to 14 different households in our subdivision of 32 homes. That was nearly half the neighborhood. The infractions ranged from minor issues like slightly overgrown hedges to absurd complaints like unapproved mailbox decoration and excessive bird feeder activity attracting wildlife. She had collected over $8,000 in fines during her tenure, all of which went into the HOA's general fund. More interestingly, I discovered that Patricia had used HOA funds to hire her brother-in-law's landscaping company for all community maintenance projects, despite the fact that his bids were consistently higher than competitors. She had also authorized expensive community improvements, like new entrance signage and decorative lighting that benefited only the homes near the subdivision entrance, where she and 2 other board members lived. This was not about safety or community standards. This was about control and money. I spent the rest of Saturday documenting everything I could find. I took photographs of the icicles on my house and on every other house on my street. I made notes about Patricia's pattern of violations and questionable financial decisions. I prepared a detailed response to her citation, citing the specific language of Section 8.4 and explaining why natural icicles did not constitute a hazardous exterior condition under any reasonable interpretation. On Sunday, I emailed my response to Patricia and the entire HOA board, which consisted of Patricia and 2 other members. Gerald Morrison, a retired accountant who lived next door to Patricia, and Linda Chen, a part-time realtor who seemed to rubber stamp whatever Patricia wanted. I did not expect much from them, but I wanted everything documented in writing. Patricia responded within an hour. Her email was curt and dismissive. "Your objection has been noted and denied. The violation stands. You have 6 days remaining to comply." I was not surprised, but I was disappointed. I had hoped that perhaps Gerald or Linda might show some common sense, but neither of them responded to my email at all. On Monday morning, I went to work as usual. It was a busy day, with several meetings about an upcoming project deadline. I tried to push the HOA nonsense out of my mind and focus on my job, but it kept nagging at me. The principle of the thing bothered me more than the actual fine. If I gave in to Patricia's ridiculous demands now, where would it end? Would she next require us to prevent snow from accumulating on our roofs? Demand that we keep our driveways completely ice-free at all times during winter? When I got home that evening, there was a new notice taped to my front door. This one was from the City of Madison Code Enforcement Office. My heart sank as I pulled it down and read the contents. The notice stated that a complaint had been filed regarding my property, and that an inspector would be conducting a site visit within the next 3 business days to assess the situation. It listed the complaint as hazardous ice accumulation and included a case number for reference, so Patricia had actually done it. She had called code enforcement on me for having icicles. I went inside and immediately called the number listed on the notice. A recorded message informed me that the office was closed for the day and would reopen at 8 the next morning. I hung up and sat down heavily on my couch. This was escalating faster than I had anticipated. If the city code enforcement officer sided with Patricia, I could be facing an actual municipal violation, not just an HOA fine. That could go on my property records and potentially affect my home value or future refinancing options. I needed help. I pulled out my phone and called my buddy Trevor, who worked as an attorney specializing in real estate law. We had been friends since college, and he had helped me navigate the closing process when I bought my house. "Yosef, hey man," Trevor answered on the 3rd ring. "What's going on?" I explained the entire situation, from Patricia's initial violation notice to the code enforcement complaint. Trevor listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. "That is some next-level pettiness right there." "Tell me about it," I said. "What do I do? Can she actually get me in trouble with the city over this?" "Probably not," Trevor said. City code enforcement deals with legitimate safety hazards and building code violations. Natural icicles are not a code violation. However, if you have a serious ice dam situation, or if your gutters are damaged and causing excessive ice buildup, that could potentially be an issue. Do you have any actual problems with your roof or gutters? "No," I said. "My roof is in good condition. Gutters were cleaned in November, and the icicles are completely normal for this weather. They're no different from any other house on my street." "Then you should be fine," Trevor said. "When the code enforcement officer comes out, be polite. Explain the situation. Show them that your house is well maintained, and point out that every other house in the neighborhood has the same thing. The inspector will see that this is a frivolous complaint and close the case. What about the HOA fine? That's trickier, Trevor admitted. HOA bylaws can be tough to fight because homeowners technically agree to them when they buy the property. However, if the bylaws are being interpreted in an arbitrary or unreasonable way, you can challenge it. Based on what you have told me, Patricia's interpretation of Section 8.4 is a real stretch. Natural winter ice formation is not a hazardous exterior condition. So what are my options? First, deal with the code enforcement inspection, Trevor said. Get that off your plate. Once the city clears you, which I am confident they will, you will have documentation that a professional inspector found no violation. That strengthens your position against the HOA. Then, you can formally appeal the HOA fine. The bylaws should have a process for that. They do, I said, having read through them earlier. I have to submit a written appeal to the board within 14 days of receiving the violation. Good, do that. And if the board denies your appeal, which they probably will given that Patricia runs the show, you can take it to mediation or small claims court. Most judges do not look kindly on HOA overreach, especially when it comes to naturally occurring weather conditions. I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. Thanks, man. I really appreciate the advice. Anytime, Trevor said. And hey, document everything. Photos, emails, copies of all notices. If this does end up in front of a judge, you want a paper trail showing that the HOA is being unreasonable. Already on it, I said. Good luck, Trevor said. And try not to let this stress you out too much. You are in the right here. After I hung up, I felt more prepared to handle the situation. I spent the evening taking even more detailed photographs of my property, including close-ups of the roof, gutters, and icicles from multiple angles. I also took photos of 5 other houses on my street, showing that their icicle situations were identical to mine. The next morning, I called the code enforcement office as soon as they opened. A woman with a pleasant voice answered and looked up my case number. Yes, Mr. Abrams, she said. We received a complaint regarding ice accumulation on your property. Inspector Rodriguez will be coming out on Wednesday morning between 9 and 11 to assess the situation. Can you tell me what specifically was reported? I asked. The complaint states that you have dangerous icicles that pose a threat to pedestrians and neighboring properties, she said, her tone suggesting she had heard plenty of ridiculous complaints in her time. Inspector Rodriguez will determine if there is any actual code violation. Thank you, I said. I will be home Wednesday morning. Wednesday could not come fast enough. I went to work on Tuesday and tried to focus, but my mind kept wandering back to the situation. Several of my coworkers noticed I was distracted and asked if everything was okay. I gave them the abbreviated version of the story, and they were universally sympathetic and outraged on my behalf. That is insane, said my colleague Marcus, shaking his head. We all have icicles right now. It is winter in Wisconsin. What does she expect you to do about it? She expects me to pay someone to knock them down, I said, which would be pointless because new ones would just form the next day. HOAs are the worst, added Jennifer, another engineer on my team. I specifically bought a house outside any HOA jurisdiction because I did not want to deal with that kind of nonsense. You should fight this. I plan to, I assured her. That evening, I drafted my formal appeal letter to the HOA board. I kept it professional but firm, explaining why Patricia's interpretation of Section 8.4 was unreasonable and providing photographic evidence that icicles were present on every house in the neighborhood. I cited Wisconsin's climate and the current weather conditions, and I requested that the violation be dismissed and no fine assessed. Wednesday morning arrived cold and gray. I had taken the morning off work so I could be present for the code enforcement inspection. At 9:15, a white city truck pulled up in front of my house. A man in his late 40s climbed out, wearing a heavy jacket with code enforcement printed on the back. He carried a clipboard and a camera. I met him on my front walkway. "Inspector Rodriguez?" I asked. "That's me," he said, extending a gloved hand. "You must be Mr. Abrams." "I am," I said, shaking his hand. "Thanks for coming out." "No problem," he said, his breath visible in the frigid air. "I understand there is a complaint about ice on your property." "Yes," I said. "My HOA board president reported me for having icicles on my roof. Natural icicles from the recent cold weather." Inspector Rodriguez looked up at my roof, then looked at the house next door, then looked back at me with an expression of mild disbelief. "Icicles? Like normal winter icicles?" "Exactly," I said. "Every house on the street has them. I can show you." "Please do," he said. We walked down the sidewalk together, and I pointed out the icicles hanging from my neighbors' homes. Every single one had comparable or larger ice formations. Inspector Rodriguez took several photos and made notes on his clipboard. "This is one of the stranger complaints I have received," he admitted. "Can you show me your roof and gutters more closely?" "Absolutely," I said. We returned to my house, and I walked him around the entire property. He examined my roof from all angles, checked the condition of my gutters, and even used a small ladder from his truck to get a closer look at one section of the roof edge. "Your gutters are clean and in good repair," he said, climbing back down. "Your roof is in good condition. There is no ice dam formation, no structural damage, nothing that would constitute a code violation. These are just normal icicles from snow melting and refreezing, which happens on literally every building in Wisconsin during winter." Relief flooded through me. "So there is no violation?" "None whatsoever," Inspector Rodriguez said firmly. He made a few more notes on his clipboard. "I am closing this case as unfounded. There is no safety hazard here, no code violation, and no action required on your part." "Thank you," I said sincerely. "Can I get documentation of that?" "You will receive a letter within a few days stating that the inspection was completed and no violation was found," he said. "You can also call the office and request a copy of my inspection report." "I appreciate you coming out," I said. Inspector Rodriguez shook his head, a wry smile on his face. "Between you and me, this sounds like an HOA dispute that should have never involved the city. We have limited resources and real code violations to deal with. People who file frivolous complaints waste everyone's time and taxpayer money." "The HOA president has been looking for reasons to fine me," I said. "This is just her latest attempt." "Unfortunately, I have seen that before," he said. "HOAs can be helpful for maintaining community standards, but sometimes you get power-hungry board members who take things too far. My advice: fight the HOA fine. You have done nothing wrong, and now you have official documentation from the city saying so." "That is exactly what I plan to do," I said. Inspector Rodriguez packed up his equipment and drove away. I went back inside my warm house and immediately called Trevor to update him. "Perfect," Trevor said when I told him about the inspection. "That is exactly what you needed. The code enforcement report will be solid evidence in your favor if this goes to mediation or court." "I already drafted my appeal letter to the HOA," I said. "Should I send it now?" "Yes, send it today," Trevor said. "Include a copy of the code enforcement notice showing that an inspection was conducted. Once you receive the official letter saying no violation was found, send that too as supplementary documentation. I did exactly that. I emailed my appeal letter to all 3 board members and sent hard copies via certified mail, so I would have proof they received it. In the letter, I respectfully but firmly requested that the violation be rescinded and stated that I would not be paying any fine for naturally occurring winter weather conditions. Patricia responded that same evening. Her email was even more hostile than before. Mr. Abrams, your appeal is denied. The HOA board has the authority to determine what constitutes a hazardous condition under Section 8.4, and we have determined that the icicles on your property pose an unacceptable risk. The City Code enforcement inspection is irrelevant to HOA governance. You now have 4 days remaining to comply with the violation notice. If you do not remedy the situation by Sunday at midnight, a $500 fine will be assessed to your account, and a lien may be placed on your property for non-payment. Regards, Patricia Wainwright, HOA Board President. I stared at the email in disbelief. She was actually going to fine me $500 for having icicles. Natural, unavoidable, completely normal icicles. I forwarded the email to Trevor. He called me back within minutes. She is threatening a lien, he said, sounding angry on my behalf. That is way over the line. You cannot put a lien on someone's property for refusing to comply with an unreasonable and arbitrary interpretation of a vague bylaw. What do? I asked. Let her assess the fine, Trevor said. Do not pay it. We will challenge it through the formal dispute resolution process outlined in your HOA bylaws. If that does not work, we will take it to small claims court. I will represent you if it comes to that. I do not want you to work for free, I said. We will work something out, Trevor said. But honestly, this is such an egregious overreach that it will not take much work. Any reasonable mediator or judge will side with you. I hope you are right, I said. Sunday came and went. I did not remove the icicles from my roof because that would have been pointless. The temperature remained well below freezing, and new icicles would have formed within hours anyway. On Monday morning, I received an automated email from the HOA management company informing me that a $500 fine had been assessed to my account for violation of Community Guidelines Section 8.4. I immediately filed a formal dispute with the HOA management company, as outlined in the bylaws. The process required me to submit a written explanation of why I believed the fine was unjust, along with any supporting documentation. I included copies of all my photos, the code enforcement inspection notice, and a detailed argument about why Patricia's interpretation of Section 8.4 was unreasonable. According to the bylaws, the HOA board had 30 days to review my dispute and issue a ruling. I suspected I knew how that would turn out, but I had to follow the proper procedure. In the meantime, life continued. The weather gradually warmed up over the next 2 weeks, and the icicles on my house naturally melted away. Of course, by that time, it was too late. The violation period had passed, and the fine had been assessed. Patricia had gotten what she wanted, except she had not really, because I was not going to pay the fine and I was not going to let her get away with this abuse of power. 3 weeks after I filed my dispute, I received the HOA board's response. It was signed by all 3 board members and stated, in bureaucratic language, that my appeal was denied. The fine would stand, and I had 30 days to pay it or face additional late fees and potential legal action. I called Trevor immediately. Time to file in small claims court, he said. I will help you draft the complaint. We're going to argue that the HOA fine was arbitrary, capricious, and based on an unreasonable interpretation of the bylaws. We'll also point out that Patricia has been systematically targeting homeowners with frivolous violations, which suggests a pattern of abuse of authority. Over the next few days, Trevor and I prepared my small claims complaint. Wisconsin's small claims courts could handle disputes up to $10,000, which was more than sufficient for a $500 HOA fine. The filing fee was minimal, and the process was designed to be accessible to individuals without extensive legal representation. We filed the complaint in early March, and Patricia was served with the court summons a week later. I have to admit, there was a certain satisfaction in knowing that she was finally being forced to defend her ridiculous violation in front of a neutral third party. The court date was set for mid-April. In the meantime, something interesting happened. I started receiving emails and phone calls from other homeowners in Meadowbrook Estates. Apparently, word had gotten around that I was challenging Patricia in court, and several people wanted to share their own stories of HOA harassment. A woman named Susan Tremaine, who lived on the opposite side of the subdivision, told me that Patricia had fined her $300 for painting her front door a shade of red that was supposedly not on the approved color list, even though Susan had specifically chosen the color from the HOA's own approved palette. When Susan tried to appeal, Patricia had dismissed her complaint without even reviewing the evidence. Another homeowner, Richard Donnelly, had been fined for allowing his grass to grow to 4 inches tall, which Patricia claimed was a violation of the lawn maintenance requirement. Richard was an elderly man who had been in the hospital recovering from surgery at the time and had arranged for a lawn service to mow his grass. The service had simply fallen behind schedule due to heavy rain. Patricia had shown no sympathy and refused to waive the fine. The more I heard, the clearer it became that Patricia was running the HOA like her personal fiefdom. She was targeting anyone who annoyed her or failed to show her sufficient deference, and she was using the vague language of the bylaws to justify whatever punishments she wanted to impose. I started documenting all of these stories. With permission from the other homeowners, I compiled a list of Patricia's violations over the past year, along with written statements from several residents describing their experiences. Trevor thought this information could be useful in court to establish a pattern of behavior. As April approached, I prepared for the court hearing. Trevor coached me on what to expect and how to present my case clearly and professionally. The key was to stay calm, stick to the facts, and let the evidence speak for itself. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock. I took the day off work and met Trevor at the Dane County Courthouse downtown. The building was an imposing structure with tall columns and marble floors. We checked in at the small claims division and took seats in the waiting area outside the courtroom. Patricia arrived about 10 minutes later, accompanied by a man in an expensive suit who I assumed was her attorney. She looked annoyed at having to be there. Her lawyer, a middle-aged man with silver hair and a practiced smile, introduced himself as David Hutchinson from a downtown law firm. "This is a small claims hearing," Trevor said quietly to me. She didn't need to hire an attorney, but I guess she wants to make a statement. The bailiff called our case at 10:15, and we all filed into the small courtroom. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Judge Sarah Klein, sat behind the bench reviewing our case file. "Good morning," Judge Klein said. "This is case number 2026 SC004729, Yosef Abrams versus Meadowbrook Estates Homeowner Association. Mr. Abrams is challenging a $500 fine assessed by the HOA. Mr. Abrams, you are the plaintiff, so you will present your case first." I stood up, feeling nervous but prepared. "Thank you, Your Honor. I am challenging this fine because it was based on an arbitrary and unreasonable interpretation of the HOA bylaws. In January of this year, I received a violation notice from the HOA claiming that I was in violation of Section 8.4 of the Community Guidelines for having icicles on my roof." Judge Klein looked up from the file, her eyebrows slightly raised. "Icicles? As in, ice formed from snow melting and refreezing?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "Natural icicles that formed during a cold spell when temperatures were consistently below freezing. Every house in my neighborhood had similar icicles. I have photographs documenting this." I handed a folder of photographs to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. Judge Klein flipped through them, her expression neutral. The HOA board president, Patricia Wainwright, claimed that the icicles constituted a hazardous exterior condition under Section 8.4. I continued. When I objected, she reported me to City Code Enforcement. An inspector from the City of Madison came to my property and found no code violation. I have the inspection report here. I provided another document to the bailiff. Judge Klein read it carefully. Despite the code enforcement finding, the HOA board maintained that I was in violation and assessed a $500 fine, I said. "I believe this fine is unjust because natural winter ice formation is not a hazardous exterior condition under any reasonable interpretation of the bylaws. Additionally, I was being selectively targeted while other homeowners with identical icicles were not cited." I sat down, and Judge Klein turned to Patricia's attorney. "Mr. Hutchinson, you may present the HOA's position." David Hutchinson stood up smoothly. "Thank you, Your Honor. The Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, takes its responsibility to maintain community safety and standards very seriously. Section 8.4 of our bylaws grants the board authority to address hazardous exterior conditions. While Mr. Abrams may feel that icicles are harmless, they can in fact pose a significant danger if they fall and strike someone. The board was within its authority to require Mr. Abrams to address this safety concern." "Mr. Hutchinson," Judge Klein said, "did the HOA board cite any other homeowners for icicles during the same time period?" There was a brief pause. "I would have to review the records to answer that definitively, Your Honor." "Mr. Abrams has provided photographs showing that multiple homes in the subdivision had similar or identical icicles," Judge Klein said. "Was anyone else fined?" Patricia leaned over and whispered something to her attorney. Hutchinson looked uncomfortable. "Not to my knowledge, Your Honor." "So Mr. Abrams was singled out. The board addresses violations as they become aware of them," Hutchinson said. "If other homeowners also had hazardous icicles but were not reported, that does not negate the fact that Mr. Abrams was in violation." Judge Klein did not look convinced. "Mr. Hutchinson, I have lived in Wisconsin my entire life. I have icicles on my own house every winter. Are you seriously arguing that natural ice formation during winter constitutes a hazardous exterior condition that justifies a $500 fine?" "The HOA board has broad discretion to interpret the bylaws and maintain community standards," Hutchinson said, falling back on the legal argument. "Courts generally defer to HOA board decisions unless there is evidence of bad faith or gross abuse of discretion." "Let me see the exact language of Section 8.4, Judge Klein said. Hutchinson provided a copy of the bylaws and the judge read the section carefully. After a moment, she looked up. "This section lists specific examples: damaged roofing materials, loose siding, unstable structures." Natural icicles do not fall into any of those categories. The language or any other condition that may pose a danger seems clearly intended to cover similar maintenance-related issues, not weather phenomena. With respect, Your Honor, the Board has the authority to make that determination, Hutchinson said. Actually, I have the authority to determine whether the Board's interpretation was reasonable, Judge Klein said, a slight edge to her voice. And based on the evidence presented, I find that it was not. Mr. Abrams, did you want to present any additional evidence? Trevor stood up. Your Honor, if I may, we have compiled statements from other homeowners in Meadowbrook Estates, documenting a pattern of arbitrary enforcement and questionable violations by the current board president. While not directly related to this specific case, it provides context for understanding whether the HOA is acting in good faith. I will hear it, Judge Klein said. Trevor handed over the compiled statements and violation records I had gathered. Judge Klein took her time reviewing them, and I watched as her expression grew more disapproving. Mrs. Wainwright, Judge Klein said, addressing Patricia directly. It appears that you have assessed nearly $9,000 in fines over the past 10 months, with violations ranging from icicles to bird feeders to mailbox decorations. Can you explain this pattern of enforcement? Patricia stood up, clearly not happy to be questioned directly. Your Honor, as board president, it is my responsibility to ensure that all homeowners comply with community standards. Some residents have been lax in maintaining their properties, and the board has had to take action. Have you assessed any fines against yourself during your tenure as board president? Judge Klein asked. Patricia hesitated. I maintain my property in accordance with all community guidelines. That was not my question, Judge Klein said. Have you issued any violation notices or fines to yourself? No, Your Honor. Have you issued violation notices to the other 2 board members? No, Your Honor. But you have issued violations to nearly half of the other homeowners in the subdivision. Patricia's face was turning red. The board members maintain their properties appropriately. Others have not. Judge Klein set down the documents and looked at Patricia with obvious skepticism. Mrs. Wainwright, this court does not exist to rubber stamp HOA board decisions. When an HOA assesses a fine based on an unreasonable interpretation of its bylaws and engages in selective enforcement, that is an abuse of discretion. Based on the evidence presented today, I find that the $500 fine assessed against Mr. Abrams was arbitrary, capricious, and unjustified. I felt a surge of relief and vindication. The fine is hereby vacated, Judge Klein continued. The HOA is ordered to remove it from Mr. Abrams's account and refrain from any further enforcement action related to this alleged violation. Additionally, Mr. Abrams is awarded his filing fees and costs. Your Honor, Hutchinson interjected, with respect, the HOA board has broad authority, Mr. Hutchinson. I have made my ruling, Judge Klein said firmly. The fine is vacated. Furthermore, I strongly suggest that the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board review its enforcement practices and ensure that bylaws are interpreted reasonably and applied consistently. If I see another case like this come through my courtroom, I will not be pleased. The hearing was over. Trevor and I walked out of the courtroom, and I could not stop the smile spreading across my face. That went even better than I expected, Trevor said, clapping me on the shoulder. Judge Klein clearly saw through Patricia's nonsense. Thank you so much for your help, I said. I could not have done this without you. Happy to help, Trevor said. And hey, you did the right thing by fighting back. If more people challenged unreasonable HOA decisions, we would have fewer tyrant board presidents. Patricia and her attorney left the courthouse quickly, avoiding eye contact with me. I could only imagine how angry she was at having her authority publicly challenged and overruled. Over the next few days, word of the court ruling spread quickly through Meadowbrook Estates. Several homeowners reached out to thank me and share their relief that someone had finally stood up to Patricia. Susan Tremaine called to tell me she was filing her own small claims case to recover the $300 fine she had paid for her door color. Richard Donnelly said he was considering doing the same, but the real bombshell came 2 weeks after the court hearing. I received an email from Gerald Morrison, one of the other HOA board members, requesting an emergency meeting with me and several other homeowners. We met at a coffee shop in downtown Madison on a Saturday afternoon. In addition to Gerald, there was Linda Chen, the third board member, plus Susan, Richard, and 3 other homeowners who had been on the receiving end of Patricia's enforcement actions. Gerald, a soft-spoken man in his late 60s, looked uncomfortable as he addressed the group. "I want to start by apologizing. Linda and I have allowed Patricia to run roughshod over this HOA for nearly a year now, and we should have stopped it much sooner." "Why didn't you?" Susan asked, not unkindly. "Honestly, she is intimidating," Gerald admitted. "She came onto the board with very strong opinions about how things should be run, and she made it clear that she did not want dissent. Linda and I went along with her decisions because it was easier than fighting." "That was wrong." Linda nodded in agreement. After the court hearing, Gerald and I started reviewing all of Patricia's violation notices and fines in detail. What we found was disturbing. She has been using HOA enforcement as a personal vendetta against anyone she does not like. Some of the violations are legitimate, but many are questionable at best and absurd at worst. "Like my icicles," I said. "Exactly," Linda said. "We also discovered some financial irregularities. Patricia has been directing HOA funds to her brother-in-law's company without proper competitive bidding. That is a conflict of interest and potentially a breach of her fiduciary duty." "What are you going to do about it?" Richard asked. "We are calling for a special meeting of all homeowners to vote on removing Patricia from the board," Gerald said. "The bylaws allow for recall of board members with a 2/3 vote. We need to gather signatures from at least 20% of homeowners to trigger the special meeting." "You will have mine," I said immediately. Several others around the table echoed the sentiment. "We will also be conducting a full audit of HOA finances," Linda added. "If there has been any misappropriation of funds, we will take appropriate action." Over the next week, Gerald and Linda circulated a petition calling for Patricia's removal. They had no trouble gathering the required signatures. In fact, they got nearly 70% of homeowners to sign, which was a clear indication of how fed up everyone was with Patricia's leadership. The special meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening in early May. It was held in the community clubhouse, a small building near the subdivision entrance that was typically used for holiday parties and HOA meetings. By the time I arrived at 7 o'clock, the room was packed. Almost every household in Meadowbrook Estates had sent at least one representative. Patricia sat at the front table, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. Gerald and Linda sat on either side of her, looking resolute. Gerald called the meeting to order and explained the purpose of the gathering. "We are here tonight to vote on whether to remove Patricia Wainwright from her position as HOA board president and as a member of the board. This action is being taken due to concerns about arbitrary enforcement of community guidelines, financial mismanagement, and abuse of authority. Before we vote, homeowners will have the opportunity to speak. One by one, people stood up to share their experiences. Susan described the door color fine. Richard talked about being penalized while recovering from surgery. A woman named Michelle explained how Patricia had threatened to fine her for displaying a small pride flag in her front window, claiming it violated rules about exterior decorations, even though the bylaws said no such thing. When it was my turn, I kept it brief. Patricia fined me $500 for having icicles on my roof during a Wisconsin winter. A city code enforcement inspector found no violation. A judge ruled that the fine was arbitrary and unjust. That is all I need to say. Patricia was given the opportunity to defend herself. She stood up, her voice shaking with anger. I have dedicated countless hours to this community. I have enforced the rules fairly and consistently, even when it was not popular. If people do not like having standards, perhaps they should have chosen to live somewhere without an HOA. It was not a compelling defense. The contempt in her voice only reinforced why everyone wanted her gone. The vote was conducted by secret ballot. Gerald and Linda counted the votes while we waited. When they finished, Gerald stood up to announce the results. By a vote of 27-3, with 2 abstentions, Patricia Wainwright is removed from the HOA board effective immediately. The room erupted in applause. Patricia grabbed her purse and stormed out without another word, slamming the door behind her. In the aftermath of Patricia's removal, the HOA board underwent significant changes. Gerald remained on the board and was elected as the new president. Linda stayed as well. A special election was held to fill the third board position, and Susan Tremaine was elected, which I thought was appropriate given her own experience with Patricia's overreach. The new board immediately implemented several reforms. They established clearer guidelines for when violations could be issued, and required that all violation notices include photographic evidence and specific bylaw citations. They also created an independent review committee made up of non-board homeowners who could hear appeals, ensuring that the board did not act as judge, jury, and executioner. Most importantly, they refunded or forgave nearly $6,000 in questionable fines that Patricia had assessed. The HOA conducted a full financial audit and discovered that Patricia had indeed steered over $12,000 in contracts to her brother-in-law's landscaping company without competitive bidding. The matter was referred to an attorney who specialized in HOA governance issues. As for me, my life returned to normal. The bogus fine was removed from my account, and I received a formal apology from the new board. I continued living in my house, maintaining it properly, and generally enjoying my life without the constant threat of arbitrary violation notices. The following winter, when icicles inevitably formed on my roof again, no one said a word. One Saturday afternoon in early December, nearly a year after the whole ordeal began, I was out front stringing Christmas lights on my porch when Susan walked by with her dog. "Those look great," she said, stopping to admire my handiwork. "Thanks," I said. "I am keeping them up until at least January 6th, maybe longer if I feel like it." Susan laughed. "No one is going to give you grief about holiday lights anymore. The new board is actually reasonable." "It is amazing what a difference leadership makes," I said. "You know, you should consider running for the board yourself," Susan suggested. "Your term could come up in the spring election. We need people who are willing to stand up for common sense." I thought about it for a moment. A year ago, I would have said absolutely not. I had no interest in HOA politics or spending my free time dealing with neighborhood disputes. But after everything that had happened, I understood how important it was to have reasonable people in those positions. Maybe I will, I said. Let me think about it. Susan smiled. Good. We need more Yosefs and fewer Patricias in the world. She continued on her walk, and I went back to hanging my lights. The afternoon was cold but clear, and the sun was starting to set behind the houses across the street. Inside my house, I had a fire going and dinner in the slow cooker. Life was good. I thought back to that morning in January when I had received Patricia's ridiculous violation notice about Icicles. At the time, I had been angry and frustrated, unable to believe that someone could be so petty and unreasonable. But fighting back had been worth it, not just for me, but for all the other homeowners who had been dealing with Patricia's tyranny. Standing up to abuse of power is never easy. It takes time, energy, and sometimes money. It would have been simpler to just pay the $500 fine and move on with my life. But some principles are worth fighting for. The right to live in your home without harassment over trivial and arbitrary rules is one of them. As I finished hanging the last string of lights, my neighbor Tom came out of his house next door. "Looking good, Yosef," he called out. "Thanks," I said. "How are things?" "Pretty great, actually," Tom said. "Just got back from Florida visiting family. It is nice to come home and not worry about whether the HOA is going to cite me for something ridiculous while I was gone." "That is the truth," I agreed. Tom walked over, and we stood together in the fading light, looking at my decorated porch. "You know, I never thanked you properly for standing up to Patricia," he said. "A lot of us were too intimidated to fight back, but you did. You made this neighborhood a better place." "I was just defending myself," I said, feeling a bit embarrassed by the praise. "You did more than that," Tom insisted. "You showed everyone that the HOA board is not above accountability. That mattered." We talked for a few more minutes before Tom headed back inside. I plugged in my Christmas lights, checking that they all worked properly. The warm white bulbs glowed softly in the twilight, making my front porch look inviting and festive. I went inside and poured myself a bourbon, then settled onto my couch with my laptop. Out of curiosity, I pulled up the Meadowbrook Estates HOA website. The new board had updated it significantly, making the bylaws easier to read and adding a section with contact information for all board members, meeting minutes, and financial reports. Everything was transparent now, which was a refreshing change from Patricia's secretive approach. I clicked through the meeting minutes from the past few months and was pleased to see that the board was focusing on actual issues, arranging for snow removal on community sidewalks, planning improvements to the playground near the subdivision entrance, and addressing a drainage problem that affected several properties. These were the kinds of things an HOA should be handling, not nitpicking about icicles and mailbox decorations. My phone buzzed with a text from Trevor. "Hey man, happy holidays. Still icicle free," I smiled and texted back. "Actually have some nice ones forming. No complaints so far. Good. Let me know if Patricia's ghost tries to haunt you." "Will do. Thanks again for everything." "Anytime." I set my phone down and took a sip of bourbon, savoring the warmth. The fire crackled softly in the fireplace, and outside my window, my Christmas lights glowed against the dark evening sky. This was my home, and I had fought to keep it free from unreasonable interference. That was something to be proud of. The whole experience had taught me an important lesson about standing up for yourself, even when it seems easier to just comply. Power unchecked tends to grow, and small injustices, if left unchallenged, become precedents for larger ones. If I had simply paid Patricia's fine and removed those icicles, she would have been emboldened to come up with even more creative and absurd violations. By fighting back, I had not only protected myself but helped protect all my neighbors as well over the following weeks, as winter settled in fully, I went about my normal routine. Work was busy, as it always was this time of year with end-of-year deadlines. I spent my evenings and weekends relaxing at home, reading, watching movies, and occasionally meeting up with friends. The HOA drama was firmly in the past, where it belonged. In February, the new HOA board held their annual meeting to discuss the upcoming year's plans and elect new officers. I attended, along with about 20 other homeowners. The atmosphere was completely different from meetings during Patricia's tenure. People were engaged and friendly, asking questions and making suggestions without fear of retribution. Susan, in her role as board member, presented a proposal to use some of the HOA's reserve funds to install better lighting along the walking paths that connected different parts of the subdivision. It was a practical improvement that would benefit everyone, and it passed unanimously. During the open comment period at the end of the meeting, Gerald mentioned that there would be a board election in April, with one seat up for grabs. "If anyone is interested in serving on the board, please let me or one of the other board members know," he said. "We are always looking for engaged homeowners who want to help make our community better." Several people glanced in my direction, and I felt that familiar pull of civic responsibility. After the meeting ended, Susan cornered me near the coffee table. "So," she said expectantly. "Are you going to run?" "I am thinking about it," I admitted. "You should," Susan said. "You have already proven that you are willing to stand up for what is right, and people respect that. Plus, you are level-headed and reasonable, which is exactly what we need." "Let me talk it over with Trevor and a few other people," I said, "but I am seriously considering it." A week later, I made my decision. I filed paperwork to run for the open board position. My platform, if you could call it that, was simple: reasonable enforcement of sensible rules, transparency in decision-making, and a focus on genuine community improvements rather than petty violations. The election was not exactly a high-stakes political race. There were only two candidates, me and a retired teacher named Margaret Davis, who had lived in the neighborhood for over a decade. Margaret was a perfectly nice person with good intentions, and I told her as much when we ran into each other at the grocery store. "May the best candidate win," she said with a warm smile. "Agreed," I said. The election was conducted by mail-in ballot, with results announced at the April board meeting. When the votes were counted, I had won with about 60% support. Margaret was gracious in defeat, and several people congratulated both of us for running. And just like that, I became a member of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board. It was not something I had ever planned or particularly wanted, but it felt right. I had fought against HOA overreach, and now I had an opportunity to help ensure it did not happen again. My first few months on the board were a learning experience. I quickly discovered that managing an HOA involved a lot of mundane administrative work. Reviewing budgets, coordinating with maintenance contractors, responding to homeowner inquiries, and planning community events. It was time-consuming but not terribly difficult. More importantly, I made sure that every decision we made as a board was fair, transparent, and reasonable. When violations needed to be issued, we made sure they were for legitimate problems. We documented everything carefully, and we gave homeowners ample opportunity to remedy the situation before assessing fines. We also made a point of applying rules consistently across the entire neighborhood, without favoritism or selective enforcement. There were occasional disagreements and challenges, of course. Not everyone was happy with every decision the board made. But overall, the atmosphere in Meadowbrook Estates improved dramatically. People stopped viewing the HOA as an adversary and started seeing it as what it should be: a volunteer organization working to maintain and improve the community. As for Patricia, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she and her husband sold their house that summer and moved to a different subdivision across town. I never saw her again, and I was perfectly fine with that. One evening in late September, nearly 2 years after the icicle incident that started it all, I was sitting on my back deck with a beer, enjoying the mild autumn weather. My phone rang and I saw it was Trevor calling. "Hey," I answered. "Hey yourself," Trevor said. "How is life as an HOA board member treating you?" "Not bad, actually," I said. "It is work, but it is satisfying work. We just approved funding for a new community garden which people are really excited about." "That is great," Trevor said. "A far cry from fining people for icicles." "No kidding," I said. "How are things with you?" "Good, good. I am actually calling because I wanted to tell you something. Remember how I helped you with your case? Of course, I still owe you for that." "You do not owe me anything," Trevor said. "But that case actually led to something interesting. Another HOA dispute case came across my desk a few weeks ago, and the client specifically asked for me because he had heard about your icicle case. Apparently, word gets around in HOA circles." "Is that right?" I said, amused. "Yeah. And I have to say, working on your case reminded me why I went into law in the first place. It felt good to help someone fight back against bureaucratic nonsense. I am thinking about taking on more HOA cases, maybe even making it a specialty." "That is awesome," I said sincerely. "There are definitely people who need that kind of help. Thanks to you, I am building a reputation as the guy who fights HOA overreach," Trevor said. "So I guess what I am saying is thank you. Fighting Patricia was not just good for you and your neighborhood. It was good for me too." We talked for a while longer, catching up on life and swapping stories. After I hung up, I sat on my deck for a long time, watching the sun set behind the trees and thinking about how strange life could be. A ridiculous violation notice about icicles had led to a court case, which had led to an HOA board recall, which had led to significant reforms in my neighborhood, which had led to me joining the board myself, which had led to Trevor finding a new professional focus. Small actions could have ripple effects that extended far beyond their initial impact. The air was getting chilly as the sun dipped below the horizon. I finished my beer and went inside, where my house was warm and comfortable. On the refrigerator, held up by a magnet, was a printed copy of Judge Klein's ruling in my favor. I had kept it as a reminder: stand up for what is right, even when it seems like a small thing. Especially when it seems like a small thing. Because sometimes, fighting over icicles is really about fighting for something much bigger. It is about refusing to be bullied. It is about holding people in power accountable. It is about making your community a better place, one reasonable decision at a time. And that, I thought, was worth all the trouble.